Hello everyone, today we talk about the Roman military camp of early imperial times. We already made a video on the Republican one, on the account of Polybius. This one, as we will see, is fundamentally based on the detailed De Munitionibus Castrorum by Hyginus, or Pseudo-Hyginus, not to confuse him with another Hyginus that was an author of practical works on the centuriation and terrain mesurations, right? Hyginus lived around 2nd century AD, so we're more or less at this point. And his treaty is written, interestingly, as a form of practical manual destined to the metatores, that were basically the military land surveyors and entrusted with the, at least outlining of the camp per se. So in this kind of in fact, sketchy phase, more or less, what the structure of the camp really was, because this is what we're talking about today. Actually, there is a lot about the early Roman imperial camp to tell. Today, we will stick to the outline, right? Eventually, we will go with other videos more in depth with the various parts of the Praetoria, etc. And for today, we stick just to that, really, and confronting it a bit also with the Republican camp, and stating right off with the obvious, right, that is essentially that the Roman camps, of course, were famous, especially at this point, for their fundamental equality and precision of construction, that obviously varied in reality, right? We have naturally a lot of archaeological finds that, however, mostly tell us about those camps that were eventually transformed into permanent fortresses. Hyginus really talks about the encampment during camping, right? The one that, according to Flavius Josephus, in his Jewish Antiquities, says that the Romans were basically, starting and building, every day at the end of the march, and therefore building a new one at every stop. Naturally, the thing that the topic is very interesting, because we know, as always, for those times and about the Roman army in general, a very few things, right? We don't know exactly how this happened, how this differed, naturally, for example, in friendly territory or in enemy territory. We can't reason by analogy with other more recent, military, practical realities that are basically unchanged, like the space covered by a certain amount of people and animals with supplies, etc., is basically the same. This is often overlooked, given especially the logistical needs of these camps, and the fact that these are constants throughout all of history, right? You can know with reasonable certainty basically how much, for example, an army consumed on the field, right? It's more difficult, of course, to assess how many the troops really were, but once you have a fairly, reliable number, you can actually say, there is this space needed, there is this amount of food needed and water needed, and you can understand at that point, by the sheer magnitude of these quantities, how much effort, naturally, how much logistics is important in this regard, and how these art, fortificatory art, we can art of fortification, was necessarily developed at the time, and how even the naturally the peak, the achievements of the Roman army that we regard, in fact, as the acme of the ancient world, and the military art, etc., were necessary also to other peoples, right? We know much about Roman encampments, as we were saying before, also because we have even archaeological finds of this empire that stretched across Europe, Africa, and Asia, that left an enormous amount of infrastructures for those time standards for us to find today. But don't think in this sense other peoples also were so backwards compared to that, right? In the sense that once you have, of course, the Germans didn't build anything like that, right? It was very interesting a few years ago. I don't remember where actually. I wish I knew more about it, but archaeological proclaims are sometimes a bit too, echoing and classical in many ways. But they found in Germany what seems to have been a Roman camp in the heart of Germany, actually, and it was very interesting. The local archaeologist said, we're pretty sure that this is Roman because the Germans didn't build anything like that. And the reason they didn't is they didn't need that. They didn't need to, of course, because their political and social structures hadn't developed anything like a permanent professional army, right? That is something that just empires, or at least advanced, statal forms and systems can afford, right? But we don't have to think in this regard that, I don't know, a Germanic army or a Celtic army didn't have their own encampments, or that the Romans were born, for that matter, with their own, pre-arranged, and classical camp, right? And this is very fascinating, actually, for the Romans, because we know much more about them, so we can trace that history and that development over time. Today we look naturally at the camp structure as it was at its apex, right, of systematicity, let's say, and and complexity at the same time. When the empire was at the peak of its resource availability, for example, and had a very balanced ratio between the military and its the available resources and so on, and where we can find more easily, in fact, this reliance, this constance on these forms of encampment that were taken definitely in their building as a form of training, right? The same Flavius Josephus, for example, says that that for the Romans, battle is just basically training where you shed a bit of blood, and it was really like that, because the Roman training was something that, I don't know what, it was at the limit of sadism, but that's really what you need to have the rigid discipline that the Roman army displayed in here, and that allowed you to achieve enormous feats in their own time, and this included, in fact, this apparent, at least, constants in the building of the camp, right? We can speculate on how, even for example, in friendly territory, how this actually happened, considering also that over time, exactly in this centuries, the Romans were going on with these permanent fortifications, the legionary camps that transformed into cities, right? And so many European cities today we live are actually a consequence of that. You can still find the Roman base of that began as an encampment, but eventually was maintained. That is to say that, as for many aspects of the Roman military, actually, we are not sure how much the Romans replicated this, right? Building camp every single day is something that naturally has its own logic, especially when you want to test the efficiency of this army, and how, just getting it ready, maybe after a time of stasis anyway. The Roman legions, once they were stationed on certain borders, they basically didn't move for centuries, right? If not, a short range, fundamentally. They didn't change strategic sector, let's call it in this way. So even this constant training, it would be interesting to know how it was actually performed, right? How intensively, with how much need for even for repetition, because that we know that in every military, you can't repeat something infinite times and think that that's going to have actually an ever greater bring to a benefit all the time. We know that in order to train military professionals, you have to make them to train them intensively, and making them repeat over and over again something, but then eventually it stops. Like, you have to make them stop, because that could otherwise even turn up as a negative thing and decrease the quality of the performance, whatever they're trained to do. So even this is just an introductory observation to say that, of course, there was much less homogeneity for the Romans as for any other people in history regarding to this dynamics, right? Naturally, we live rightfully in the Western world with our admiration and pride for the achievements of the Roman civilization transferred, especially in the military. That was definitely the most efficient part of the Roman state, also the one that consumed actually more resources from the central expanses, and that is the one with which the empire actually existed, because the Roman Empire was essentially a religiously military thing, right? That's all what it was in substance and the way it could be held together. So that's right, the military had that importance, and it was the finest, definitely for ancient standards overall. But they were still human beings. They were still an empire that had enormous benefits that others hadn't had previously, that they had earned, of course, and that, however, lasted also a very long time. So aside from the later times or even previous times, right, we don't know where the Romans began to build those camps that eventually gave rise in the early empire to what we know as this fortification, fortresses and cities, etc. We don't know really between Polybius' camp and the one of Eugenius how the transformation took place, how the changes between the two models actually occurred. And we can't simply even state that, of course, every Roman camp was built in a different way, right? There was a basic pattern and certain directions that had to be preferably respected. But at the end of the day, aside even from the difference between friendly or enemy territory, the point is, every terrain is different, every place is different, every condition is different, the time, the resources, etc. The size of the army, because we will see now that actually, like Roman armies, like any other army, could vary wildly in dimension. Let's leave aside that numbers in every single campaign get depleted. You rarely have the full strength at all times. Also, not every Roman legion is actually of the same size. Right? This is obvious because no army in history has ever been of the same size, and of the same logistical needs and of the same spaces needed for that. But also because the Romans, just like any other army historically, was composed of different units. Right, a Roman army, you could think it's not the Roman legion, right? Certain campaigns were waged with several Roman legions at a time, and they had, as we'll see today, with the genus, the sum actually of a camp that had to fit multiple legions at a time. What if they split? What if they got attached? It's obvious that the size changes, right? Maybe the core structure doesn't. Right, but also that is a matter of, as we were saying before, also the size of of the army itself, of its needs and the terrain and so on. We have from the Munitionibus Castrorum actually also a lot of interesting information about the not just in fact the camp building, but also a deeper knowledge of the organizational structures of the Roman army in early imperial times. And these are very rare sources, right? What we were saying before, it's not that we know much about the Roman army. We think, at least in a general perspective, as if this Roman military had always been the way it was, and it wasn't constantly subject to change. And we rely very often on, fact, like in this case, a pair of sources fundamentally for this very long time that is literally half of a millennium, and that we have to be consider ourselves lucky to even have, right? Because it's very, very, very rare, and we wish also we had it for other people who surely wrote about it, but didn't arrive to us. Think about the Hellenistic warfare, for example. That is just to say also that the same concept of the camp, I wanted to, this sounds like a broader, subtle criticism to a Roman army. Absolutely not. As you know, I'm actually a lover of Roman army in history. And I actually wanted to say it, to arrive to a point we made other times, it actually is set in favor of the Roman army and against the concept of cultural appropriation. That is, that we often say the Romans kind of began to use their own, to build their own camps the way they did from sometimes around it's actually the Pyrrhic War, right? The fact that it's said that Pyrrhus taught allegedly the Romans how to build a camp, and that's obviously just an anecdote, which means that of course the Romans improved dramatically, especially their supply, logistical, organizational capabilities, the more they stretched towards from central to southern Italy to the broader Hellenistic world that had already a pretty advanced military that actually by that time, at the beginning of the 3rd century BC, we don't have to think was dramatically ahead to the Romans. Actually, this is very debatable in some ways, albeit I still think that the Hellenistic military culture was a hell of a and actually I think even possibly slightly superior at that point to the Roman one. But the Romans in fact expand, and guess what civilizations do when they expand? They're able to develop in ways that are even in fact successful in surpassing the other ones, and surely by the same influence of Hellenistic warfare, right? This idea that that people stole that thing from that other people because that other people has no culture, right? This is probably one of the most radically idiotic statements and philosophy of thinking we can reason, because there is not a single people in the world that has not taken, not stolen, something from other peoples. That is called civilization, because only peoples that are not civilized, when exposed to civilization, do not evolve, right? Peoples that are already civilized, when they meet another civilization, they obviously take something from it, and that is the proof, actually, especially when they are able to make an original synthesis of it and even surpass the people that they took it from, just like the Romans did. The concept of cultural appropriation is just the whining of people that today want to pretend that their culture is special just because they don't understand anything about the rest of the world. And this is valid for everything, for armor, equipment. Yeah, Celtic fanboys, don't look at me thinking that I will wink at you. No, the fact that the Romans took massively from Celtic world in terms of techniques, etc., of armor, equipment, etc., has nothing to do with the non-originality of the Roman army, which actually Roman warfare, I really hate when it's depicted like as a sum of paste and copies, right? The Roman army, the Roman military culture is probably one of the most radically original in the whole history of mankind, and I already made several videos explaining why this is the case, and which is what we are basically discovering day after day, simply by correcting certain technologistic and mechanicistic statements that have been done very lightheartedly, looking at just certain similarities or believing to the letter. At the letter to certain old ancient sources statements that have to be contextualized and understood for what they are. So every people produces an astonishing lot of things, including by drawing from other cultures. So what the Romans achieve with the camp here, we can say it's with no doubt is an accomplishment also in part of pre-existing civilizations. But this has nothing to do with the capability and the original, in fact, character that the Romans were able to give to the same, right? And the easiest way, as we were saying before, to correct this is simply realizing that every people has some form of encampment, and the way it was built was something developing, like just culture does over time, right? And different needs and practice and exercise, and also linking to another concept that we expressed before, the fact that an army has this is famous, like the Roman one, for this kind of equipment, has actually a few to do with the homogeneity of the Roman encampments as such over time, right? It's not that a camp or the ability of making a camp remains there, right, as a magic capacity that if you do not revive, if you do not train your troops for, is going always to remain, right? Things must be developed, and the fact that sometimes they even fall out of use, at least in forms of before, have a much more cogent, practical, and actually positive explanation that is often regarded, right? It's obvious that during the early empire, the Roman army had certain specific military needs that it didn't have in the so-called late empire, that it hadn't had it even in the Middle Republic, for example. And that always varied in a way or in another. So, passing to Hyginus' camp, right? This was described, as we've seen, 3 centuries, perhaps, at least we don't really know, but more or less around that time, after the Polybius one, right? And look at the other video we made on the Roman Republican camp. And it presents a structure that is in fact completely different from the Polybian one. And it takes, in fact, unavoidably into account certain remarkable changes that occurred not just in the organization, but in the very culture and operational mentality of the Roman army, right? As we were saying before, we do not have many hints to establish exactly when this change occurred compared to the Republican, let's call it the Republican model, right? In the early empire, Flavius Josephus describes still a camp of quadrangular form, and we will see now, in fact, that Hyginus one is actually rectangular. And in this sense, we have a problem because we are more or less in the same time, and still we find two contradictory terms on the shape of the Roman camp. Also, the Roman Jewish source gives us other elements on the internal disposition of the encampment itself, of the tentage, that aside from the indication that the tent of the commander is placed at the center, and it's similar to a temple, doesn't make us realize more about further internal disposition. So this is interesting because, as we were saying before, things could vary even from camp to camp, from commander to commander, from campaign to campaign. We have naturally to listen very carefully at what sources tell us and at what they remain silent on, because actually the thing that they point out one aspect specifically, like the fact that the commander's camp here in Josephus is similar to a temple, obviously is loaded with heavily with cultural meaning, and that we will observe better in another video. But always realize that the ancient sources are not thinking in the way we do. They may surprise us for the incredible modernity of their thought. If you read Polybius, you say, this guy, is from the third millennium, but they are actually meaning something very different, and very often, in fact, much deeper. Especially from a semantic point of view, if we stand just to the linguistical aspect, then we are used to think, right? We are trained to reason like donkeys, for which every word must fit that specific category and cannot escape our minimalistic approach to semantics, to meaning in general. Ancient sources are dramatically sensitive, and they have a greater vision that unfortunately we have lost, just methodologically speaking. This is probably the source of the greatest mistakes that we have made historiographically in assessing them and just dealing them as just something you need to quote for finding that evidence, and they're not even thinking to contextualize it, to analyze it more deeply. Of course, the best historiography has always done this, but just the best one. We can think that maybe an important step further in the transition, let's say if there's ever been anything like this from a Polybian camp to this Aeginean camp, let's call it this way, might have been actually the Marian reform, as for many other aspects of the Roman military. And this is difficult to assess. Definitely, the Marian reform brought to an increase of professionalization, but it was also the sanction of many operational realities that were already part of the Roman military practice, sometimes even since centuries, right? There would be tons of examples to mention in this regard. Never be tricked by, even in here, the traditionalistic view of the Marian reform. The Marian reform was much more a political reform than a military one, right? The military aspect just followed the political one. Then to Marius were attributed lots of other minor changes, even technical ones, about which we can't, be really sure, right? It's not that Roman legionnaires had to, needed Marius to tell them, how to wear their shields without making it bang against their legs, or, that needed Marius to receive a pay, which is something that actually started since the siege of Veii. So there is... there would be a lot to tell here, obviously, with all the difference of the case, because the Marian salary is very different from the millet that was given to the Roman legionnaires back in the 4th century. But this is just to tell how things get diluted, transformed over time, and probably an important change in this regard that once again it was very gradual, passed through the substantial disappearance, even if not the formal one, of the different corps into which the Republican Manipulator Legion was divided, right? The Astati, Principes, and Triarii, that actually in early imperial times still existed as organical repartitions, like within the cohort. Technically, the 6 maniples were still split in that. The maniples actually still existed. In that sense, right? So, but we don't even know when that thing really ended, in fact. So it's even tricky to put it in these terms. But naturally, even the size of the legions change, and it's the same size of the units, for example. However, passing at the structure of the camp, right? So, as we were saying in the beginning, the camp described by Aeginus is of summer and non-permanent type. Therefore, it's something that was really conceived for the march in the good season, ideally, right? And it was adapted to host 3 legions, 4 Praetorian cohorts, and several auxiliary troops, for a total of 45,000 men. So it's a pretty big thing. Now, 45,000 men basically is almost the limit of a ancient world's army capability. Basically, already having 45,000 men under your command and pretending them that you're actually leading them in an orderly way is a miracle, right? I give you a 50,000 man maximum, right? If this is valid for all sources of the time. If you read any number that surpasses 50,000, you can be certain, and I stress here the word certain, that it's false, right? But it's still possible to arrive to 50,000. So just to make you understand that this camp is conceived for basically almost the largest army possible, right? And at that level of size, if it's 45,000, 50,000, doesn't even matter, as the point there is even to find the right measures, in fact, the right structures, the right space, and the right conditions to even wage that enormous amount of men. You don't even count them anymore. Consider there are many interesting examples in this regard, even in campaigns that were waged as Roman frontiers, how sometimes legions were all put together, local levies were brought in all together. So this idea, this wargamistic set of legions that were and plus auxiliary troops that were even what is auxiliary in this sense is interesting to say, because there are the permanent units, then there are other auxiliaries that Rome constantly employed. Think about the numeri or other allied troops, that were mixed all together, right? So even the standardization of these armies sometimes was very low, contrarily to our common vision about the Roman army. One thing we would probably be surprised by to see how much, in not in essence but at least in appearance, Roman legionnaires could differ in this regard. And Hyginus reports detailed informations to realize that also a much greater camp, right, capable of hosting up to 5 or even 6 legions, right? That is something, as you understand, up to 60,000, ideally, legionnaires plus auxiliary complement was theoretically possible. That is to say, at this point, you're not even reasoning about an actual marching camp. You're thinking of something that has also, a more I wouldn't say strategical value, but I mean the concept that it's not just about a marching camp, but just maybe a gathering area of some sort, which definitely existed, right, during the major offensives. And differently from Polybian's camp, Hyginus once presents, as we said before, a rectangular form with a width of 2,350 Roman feet, that is roughly 700 meters, and a width of 1,620 feet, roughly 485 meters. And the source stresses that, in fact, the length-width ratio, whichever the camp dimensions are, must be, or should be, of 3 to 2. Literally quoting Castra, in quantum fieri potuerit, tertiata esse debebunt. Right? So measures, literally the camps have to be, as much as is possible, to be thirded. Right? And the angles that take the name of coxa had to be rounded also. Angulos castrorum circinare oportet. It possibly has to do with the deployability of the internal defense for tactical reasons. And in case the camp is to be longer, well, it takes the name of classicum, right? Because in this sense, the length, not the width, of course, would have posed the Porta Decumana that we will see now at the lower end too far to hear from there the trumpet sound that was known as classicum, in fact. The central point of the camp was called Groma, as we've seen also in the Republican camp, because it took the name from the instrument that was used to trace the principal axis, right? And in fact, it's on the major axis of the camp, located at 1/3 of its length, so towards the top. Now the Groma, right, the central point, was crossed in perpendicular sense by the major axis, that is the principal street of the camp, the Via Principalis, 60 feet, hence 18 meters wide. At the extremities of the Via Principalis were the 2 gates, respectively the Principalis dextra and the Principalis sinistra, right, which means the main right and the main left gate. As in the old Republican camp, also the other 2 gates located at the extremities of the principal axis of the camp maintain the same name. The Porta Praetoria, that is posed always toward, ideally at least, in the direction of the enemy, quote, semper ostem spectare debet, that is, means literally must always be facing the enemy, and the Porta Decumana. Right, it's famous because also of the Cardo and the Decumanus, right? They were the same systems of centuriations of the Roman colonies. They were built in the same way originally, right? So that with the cardinal axis north-south, and the Decumanus that took the name from the fact that the colony got, land for plots for 100 families, and therefore, if you made the square root of the thing was 10, and therefore decimus 10th from the tithe holder, right, of that family, of the side of the square. From the square, in fact, so here naturally the names is maintained, even if it's a rectangular form at this point. So this naturally shows a continuity of terminology that is detached from the original, from the sheer geometrical principle behind which the term had been derived. So, right behind the Groma, in a central position and facing the Via Principalis, was located the Praetorium. Right, it's this rectangular space of 720 per 180 feet that was reserved to the emperor or the commander-in-chief. And behind the Praetorium extended, in parallel to the Via Principalis, the Via Quintana, that was 40 feet, or also 50 if the camp was destined to host 5 or 6 legions, feet wide. And in the latter case of the 50 feet wide, at the extremities of the Via Quintana, can be opened some additional gates, the Quintana Dextra and the Quintana Sinistra, one for each side. And from the old Republican camp, the Via Quintana preserved just the name, right? It was born back in the day when it basically delimited the tentage of the 5th manipules, right? Then the interbellum, that is the space between the most external tents of the camp and the terraplane of the with the bellum, in fact, is being reduced to 60 feet from the 200 feet of the camp described by Polybius, right? So this is also interesting because it sounds as if the structure had conferred more confidence to these troops. I mean, the space between the tents and the vallum was, so with the palisade, was meant to even give some room for internal maneuvering, even for deploying troops ready to for a sortie, right, and attack formation. Here it's being reduced. So this may possibly mean, obviously it's just pure speculation since we don't really know how this thing really happened in the end. The Roman army at this point was maybe more confident, right, or it was preceded by other, forms of, other troops or other, let's say, its intervention was more, safe or prepared. We don't know. I don't think this is a valid explanation, frankly, but at least we see that now. If you take away the internal room, it sounds like you're a bit more confident. You feel a bit more safer, and you don't need to conceive this camp as exactly one that is going to be involved in possible assaults in which you will have to sort it out. And the reason being that objectively this is a massive thing that has to do much more than the Polybian one with now an army that is an army corps fundamentally, and therefore it's something huge that of course maintains the enemy much further. Now there is another indication of this, possibly, since the legions that were considered now more reliable troops that in the past, because of the professionalization, even the the heavening, the substantial heavening of the equipment in some way, are disposed by cohorts in the most external areas. That is, to surround completely the outer tentage, besides for defending more readily the vallum, the fortification, and also they were separated from the inner sectors from a street 30 feet wide, the Via Sagularis, that ran in parallel to the vallum around the wall camp. And in the case 3 legions, that is, 3 cohorts are present, these are going to be disposed with 16 cohorts along the longer sides of the camp, 6 cohorts along the side of the Porta Praetoria, 4 cohorts along the side of the Porta Decumana, and the remaining 4, among which the 2 first cohorts at the height of the central part of the camp, so at the heart of it, in the inner part of the Via Sagularis. Right, so there is a concept of course, the elite being in the center, in a privileged position actually, because this whole thing is always to be thought also in a hierarchical sense, and also with precise also religious symbolism, as Josephus has not missed to remember. And if the camp had to host more than 3 legions, the cohorts were encamped by occupying space in a radial sense, so this towards the external, and all the smaller streets, right, that were between 10 and 20 feet wide, intersected at 90 degrees the main streets, and were called vicinariae, right? So, like, literally the neighborhoods. And the camp results hence divided in 3 parts, by the Via Principalis and by the Via Quintana. Hence the elementary tripartition of the camp side proportions. So the central part took the name of the Latera Praetorii, right, which literally are actually 2 ones that are split specularly in this sense, because it would have been Latus Praetori otherwise in the singular. And the next one to the Porta Praetoria was called Praetentura, and the one close to the Porta Decumana formed the Retentura. And it's interesting to notice how, by excluding the Retentura and the legions on the side, that the Praetentura and the Latera Praetorii give form exactly to a square camp, right, with a side of 1500 feet, according to the ancient tradition of the Republican camp, right, and all the internal spaces that are not interested in by the streets are split in plots of variable length between 60 feet wide, known as strigae, or 30 feet wide, known as hemistrigae, right? So this is more or less the structure. Then we will be making other videos about essentially these 3 parts, right, and how the troops were lodged in them. And I would stop it here. So very simple video actually, and just to give a sketch of what this thing was really like according to Eugenius, or how should it be, right? So anyway, I think everything was fairly clear, at least when it takes to explain technical stuff. I try to make it everything as simple as I can, but I think it's also visually pretty clear. And for now, I just stop it here. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.